The Flame of Caer Aerath, A Christmas Ghost Story. Our Tale of Christmas and Redemption. Anya Lysander. Elegiac Epitaph. Here rest the children of winter. Eluned, daughter of the dawn, wove destiny in the tower. Brynden, keeper of the fire, walked among ruins and shadows. Eiled heard his call and crossed snow and sea. When the last star falls over Caer Aerath, their names will still burn in the heart of the north. Summary. Scotland, 12th century. In a world of snow-covered castles and clans divided by pride, 3 destinies intertwine beneath the pale glow of the winter solstice. The old Baron Eamon Lyscaran, once powerful and feared, now lives consumed by guilt and remorse. Since the death of his wife, Éirenne, his soul has wandered through shadows, unable to find peace. But when Christmas Eve brings with it a strange wind and a blue light that does not belong to this world, the past comes knocking at his door. The spirit of Éirenne has returned, and with her, one last chance to mend what pride destroyed. Far away in the Highlands, the life of Eluned, Eamon's banished daughter, has changed. Married to the noble Luthan Maelvor, she has learned to love and to heal, though the scars of the past still pulse beneath her skin. Her son Brynden, born of Luthan's first marriage, is a youth marked by lineage and vision. Maelvor and Caerwyn blood flows in his veins, and the elders say that the gift of the blue eyes sees beyond the visible world. But fate, or the dead, has not finished with them. As the harshest winter falls upon Scotland, an act of ambition and an unforeseen abduction will bring father, daughter, and grandson together in a fog-shrouded forest, where love, guilt, and forgiveness will be tested at the edge of a blade. And while kings forge alliances and ghosts still whisper among the towers, a new flame is kindled, that of Luthan Maelvor and Eiluned of Garioch, a young noblewoman sent by King David to seal peace between enemy clans. What was meant to be a political union will become a meeting of souls, where the fire of home and the snow of winter reveal that, sometimes, love is the purest form of redemption. A Scottish Christmas ghost story in the spirit of a Christmas carol, woven with mist, love, and destiny. A tale of broken families and hearts rekindled beneath the spirit of winter. Prologue. In the days of the great winter, when the rivers froze to their very souls, and men thought they heard voices among the birches, the northern lands changed hands once more. Year of our Lord 1136. King Henry of England had died without a lawful son, and his throne, like a golden chalice, passed into the hands of his nephew Stephen of Blois, though the royal blood of the Empress Matilda cried out for justice from across the sea. In those weeks of uncertainty, David, King of the Scots, crossed the southern rivers with his white banners, saying he fought for his niece and for the peace of the borders. But peace was a scarce gift in those days. The valleys filled with smoke and the castles with prayers. In the fortress of Caer Aerath, the old Lord Eamon, whom the chroniclers of old would call the repentant, sought to redeem the sins of his lineage by rebuilding villages destroyed by war. Yet on that same frozen night, his soul found judgment. An arrow and a sword sealed his fate, and the forest bore witness to a love that survived death. From that fire and that snow, a new alliance was born. Luthan Maelvor, heir of the north and grandson of the elder Taran, was summoned to Edinburgh to pay homage to King David. There he met Eiluned of Garioch, a lady of ancient blood and eyes like thawing ice, sent by the monarch as a symbol of reconciliation between the houses. Nordhale, Castle of Caer Aerath, early December, 1136. The spirit of Caer Aerath. The wax seal broke with a faint crack. Eamon Lyscaran read the first lines of the letter and let the parchment fall as if it burned his hands. In the name of the late Lady Éirenne of Caer Aerath, deceased on the 6th day of December in the year of our Lord 1136. Éirenne was dead. His Éirenne. The woman he had loved, and then condemned, with the same passion. For years he had hidden from his daughter that her mother was still alive. He had told her she was dead, because it was easier to live with a lie than with shame. Now Éirenne's true death reached him like a delayed sentence. Everything he had denied returned with the chill of that winter afternoon. The hearth fire was out. The north wind slipped through the cracks in the stone walls, wailing like a banshee. The castle, once full of voices, was now an empty tomb. Lyscaran had not bothered to light more candles than necessary. The dimness kept him company. He sank into his chair, and memories fell upon him one by one like ancient dust. He had loved Éirenne for her sweetness, and hated her for her beauty. King Henry had looked at her only once, and that single glance had been enough to ruin everything. Since then, Eamon had lived convinced that his wife had been the king's lover, and that his daughter, Eluned, was born of that betrayal. That was why he never called her daughter. That was why he let her go when she chose to marry a Scot, a Maelvor of the Highlands, instead of staying under his roof. Only much later, when it was already too late, the king himself had confessed that he had never touched Éirenne, that her virtue had been as steadfast as her disdain for the court. And Eamon understood, far too late, that he had spent his life hating the only woman who had truly loved him, and distrusting the daughter who was, in truth, his own. Now he had only a bastard son left, of uncertain mother, lost perhaps among the living or the dead, and a cold castle, and the sound of the wind. He shut his eyes tightly, and a bitter grimace twisted his face. Everything he had possessed, lands, titles, gold, seemed as hollow as the echo of his own name. What use is gold when one turns to dust? He thought, staring at the trembling flame of the last candle. Then he heard it. A whisper, faint, almost a sigh. He raised his eyes toward the solar door. Father. His heart stopped. A small figure stood outlined in the half-light. A girl, pale as winter, with hollow cheeks and eyes so deep they seemed filled with mist. Father, she repeated. Eamon blinked, disbelieving. Could it be? No. It had to be a dream, or the delirium of a soulless old man. And yet, the voice sounded real, like an echo that had waited years to be heard. Eluned, he murmured, barely a thread of sound. The girl clung to the doorframe, fearful, as if the wind might carry her away. I'm afraid, Father, she said. And in that instant, the candle flame bent toward her, as if in recognition. A cold breeze swept through the solar, and Eamon Lyscaran, for the first time in many years, felt the weight of remorse more than that of pride. Chapter 1. The Girl of the Blue Light. I'm afraid, Father, the girl whispered. Years ago, Eamon Lyscaran would have scolded her for addressing him with such familiarity. All his life he had believed that Creature was not his daughter, or that, if she was, she had been born of sin. But now, confused, he rubbed his eyes and stuck a finger in his ear, as if to chase away an illusion. The girl was still there, trembling in the doorway. She was barely a silhouette wrapped in a bluish glow, a light that came neither from fire nor from the moon, a vision torn from a distant time. Why are you afraid? He asked in a thin voice. I can't sleep, Father. The wind howls, and my pillow is too thin. That wavering light outlined her features clearly. Eamon shivered. She looked exactly like Eluned had at that age. Your pillow is too thin. Yes, sir, the girl answered, giving a timid curtsy. Eamon ran a hand over his face. This couldn't be real. Eluned was a grown woman now, with her own home and her own children across the North Sea. And what in God's name do you expect me to do about the wind, child? He growled, struggling not to tremble. Go say your prayers and let the dead rest in peace. The girl's face darkened. But I can't sleep, Father, she said, almost in a stifled sob. You shouldn't be here, Eamon roared, taking a step back. I don't know who you are or what you're doing in my house. Out. Leave at once. For an instant, the little one looked hurt. She didn't cry. She only pressed her lips together in a stubborn gesture, identical to Eluned's when she refused to show weakness. That memory, so vivid and cruel, pierced his chest. Annoyed with himself, Eamon struck the floor with his boot, as if to drive away a ghost with a vulgar noise. The girl flinched and ran down the corridor. Her bluish glow faded slowly, dissolving into the darkness. Eamon stood motionless, his heart pounding against his ribs. And still, he could have sworn he heard the echo of her small footsteps vanishing through the empty halls. Mice, he muttered to himself. Only mice. He hadn't drunk a single drop that night, no wine, no mead. How could he be dreaming if he was so awake? He felt for the letter tucked into his belt. It was still there, cold to the touch, as though the parchment had absorbed the frost of the walls. He went on down the corridor, determined to go to bed and forget. But his feet felt like stone, his fingers swelled inside his boots, his eyes burned, and a thick unease pressed at his stomach. Too much pheasant, he thought, grasping for some earthly cause for what was happening to him. Outside, the wind became a roar, a voice that moaned through the windows and slipped through the cracks in the roof. The silence of the castle amplified that lament until it was unbearable. Then, something changed. A distant melody, soft as a thread of smoke, drifted through the air. Ah, my love, you make me ache, rejecting me with disdain, and I who loved you so dearly, find joy only in your company. Eamon stopped. The blood froze in his veins. By the Holy Cross, he whispered. What witchcraft is this? At your side I swore to serve, to give you all you desired, and I pledged my life and lands, only to remain in your favor. It was an old song, one Éirenne used to sing when they still lived together, before suspicion destroyed everything. Éirenne, he remembered bitterly. Éirenne was all my joy. Éirenne was my happiness. He had despised it. He had hated it as much as he hated her. And he had made Eluned pay for that inherited hatred. The sound came from the solar, the very room he had just left. Eamon turned on his heels, drawn by a trembling light that slipped through the crack in the door. The melody grew clearer, closer, as if someone were singing just beyond it. A woman's voice. Sweet, sad, familiar. The candle flickered, and with an unsteady step, Eamon Lyscaran went back toward the solar. Chapter 2. Éirenne's Song. I shall pray to God on high, that he may see my steadfast heart, and that once, before my death, you will swear your love for me. The solar glowed with a bluish, almost incandescent light. It was a radiance that did not belong to the world of the living. It wavered, breathed, expanded with every note of the song that filled it. Eamon Lyscaran, drawn like a moth to the flame, took an unsteady step toward the door. He knew, in the deepest part of his soul, that it could be his ruin. Yet his feet moved of their own accord. Éirenne, he whispered. No answer, only that woman's voice, pure and distant, still singing while the echo of his footsteps thundered through the empty hall, like far-off thunder rolling through stone. When he realized the noise he was making, he stopped and went on silently, almost on tiptoe. He peered through the doorway, and there she was, sitting by the fire, in the same chair where his wife once rocked their daughter. Éirenne was singing. Eamon felt his heart crack in his chest. She held no child now, only air. She swayed gently, cradling the void, as if still nursing an invisible newborn. Éirenne, he repeated, in disbelief. It was her. The same black hair, braided and loose in rebellious strands. The same face he had once believed a traitor's. For an instant, the tenderness in her eyes made him falter, almost kneel before her. But suddenly, love died in her gaze, and the blue fire of wrath took its place. She rose from the chair, and her voice broke into a cry. Eamon Lyscaran. The room blazed as if every stone exhaled blue fire. He staggered back, one hand clutching his chest, his nails digging into his flesh. Éirenne. The spectre raised a long, pale finger, pointing at him. You shall die alone, Eamon Lyscaran. It is already happening. Do you not hear the lament of eternal silence? The figure glided toward him, floating above the floor. Please, he stammered, I am but an old man. The wind wailed outside, but her voice from beyond the grave, was more terrible than any storm. The blue light grew brighter, bathing the walls like icy fire. You are not so old that you cannot repent of your deeds, she said, extending a luminous hand. Take it. No, he shouted, stumbling backward. But there was no escape. The hearth behind him erupted. He felt the heat devouring his cloak. I am as real as the flames that burn your back, said Éirenne, her voice soft and deadly. The cloak caught fire. Eamon screamed and threw it to the floor, where it burned with the stench of charred skin. Hell awaits you, Eamon, but it is your own making. What do you mean? He trembled. I need not say it. You already know. But if you must see, take my hand. He shook his head violently, sweating, gasping. The spectral hand remained, still and outstretched. Come with me, she said, in a tone as sweet as her old song. No, he whispered. But his feet betrayed him. They moved on their own until Éirenne's burning fingers brushed his. And the world changed. The cold struck him with fury. The cloak was gone, and the wind flayed his skin. He was outdoors, under a sky of lead. All around him lay the blackened ruins of the Caer Aerath graveyard. The chapel that once guarded his lineage lay in rubble. Among the debris, a single overturned grave, nameless. No flowers, no cross, no prayer. Only the dry thistles of oblivion. It's cold, Eamon murmured. The spectre smiled sadly. And colder still awaits you, Eamon Lyscaran. But I can show you the light of the sun, if you wish it. And without moving, the world changed again. Spring. The breeze smelled of heather and new earth. Eamon found himself standing on the hill of Caer Aerath. No ruins, no ice. The old stone fortress still raised its tower over a violet mantle of heather. And on the slope, some girls laughed, running among blue flowers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Their laughter was like bells. A boy came down after them, shouting, Mother says it's time. Come eat. The girls ran off, giggling. One of them, a little one with golden hair, turned for an instant. And Eamon saw in her face the features of his own daughter. He pressed a hand to his chest. My God, Éirenne, am I dead? She smiled with her ancient eyes. Not yet, Eamon. Not yet. And once again, the world changed. Now they were among the living. Men and women were rebuilding barns, repairing scorched fields. The laughter was the same as before, but tinged with weariness. And there, among them, Eluned, his daughter. No longer a child, but a woman of noble bearing, her fair hair lit by the sun. She had her mother's face. And suddenly he understood. His own as well. Eamon saw her lift a little girl into her arms, her daughter, perhaps, and laugh. His heart constricted. Dear God, he whispered. I can't see her. But Éirenne pushed him gently, guiding him closer. His daughter was speaking with her husband, the Laird Maelvor. You spoil them too much, he said. Well, Eluned replied, I won't treat them as my father treated me. The words pierced him like a blade. Each syllable was a sharp blow to his chest. We can spare a sweet for each of them, she went on. Do you think we'll have enough provisions for the winter? Do not fear, Eluned, her husband answered. Winter always passes, and spring returns. We always find a way. Eamon turned away, with tears that could not fall. What will become of them? He whispered. Éirenne gave no reply. She only reached out her hand. The scene darkened. It was the same field, but empty. The hill bare. The castle reduced to stone and dust. The barns and houses gone. Only thistles and wind, like those that lashed his forgotten grave. And then he understood. Everything he had loved, everything he had denied, was bound to him. His ruin was his legacy. Éirenne looked at him with infinite tenderness. Your deeds forge more than your own fate, Eamon. They forge the fate of all you love. The wind carried the echo of an old song. Caerwyn was all my joy. Eamon fell to his knees, weeping. And the blue fire faded away. Chapter 3. The Last Solstice. Eamon thought of the gravestone on the chapel hill. And in that very instant, as if the thought itself had summoned it, he found himself once more, standing before it. Snow was falling softly, and Éirenne, beside him, held a lit candle. The flame trembled with the rhythm of the wind, yet did not go out. Eamon trembled too. A snowflake drifted down to rest on his beard, beside him. His dead wife shed a crystalline tear that fell upon the frozen earth and melted into the snow. He looked down. At his feet, the gravestone rose like an open wound. The stone was cracked at one corner, as if someone had struck it in anger. He bent to read it. And when he saw the words carved there, he fell to his knees. The letters, almost worn away by the years, seemed written on the very dust of time. Here lies Eamon Lyscaran, last heir of the castle of Caer Aerath. Year of our Lord 1136, month of December. A shudder ran through him. The snow kept falling, slow and silent, upon his name. Éirenne spoke softly, barely a sigh in the night. Knowledge is my gift, Eamon. While there is life, there is hope. The man raised his head, eyes desperate. What must I do? Tell me, I beg you, he cried, clasping his hands. Anything, Éirenne. Tell me what I must do. The candle's light flickered, and so did Éirenne's. Her glow grew faint, fragile as a memory dissolving. She reached out and brushed his shoulder. The touch was so light that Eamon might have sworn it was only a snowflake's kiss. Before the flame goes out, in the final hour of the last day before the winter solstice, she said, you must change your heart, Eamon Lyscaran. It has changed, Éirenne. I have changed, he cried, his voice breaking. What flame? What must I do? I beg you. She spoke even more softly, as the light of her form melted into the storm. If untended, love is like a flame that fades day after day. Éirenne. He reached for her, arms outstretched, trying to seize her, to draw her close. But his hands passed through empty air, cold, intangible. Only the echo of her voice remained. You shall know love when it is returned to you, she whispered, as her figure vanished completely. And Eamon found himself alone, kneeling in the snow, in the frozen darkness of his own hall. The light was gone. The silence was so thick he could hear his own heart beating like a funeral drum. Dazed, he rose. The air inside the room was heavy, still. He walked toward the solar, where a weak candle still burned on the desk. The flame smoked, low and yellow, sending curls of vapor spiraling upward to the blackened beams. What day is it? He thought. With trembling hands, he opened the drawer of the desk and drew out a parchment he had received not long before. He unrolled it. The handwriting was firm and neat, penned by a man of God. He held it before the wavering candlelight. And then, before his eyes, the text changed. The words shifted across the parchment as if an invisible quill were writing upon the same ink. The candle smoke seemed to guide the strokes. Eamon's heart lurched when he read what now appeared. In the name of the departed, Lady Éirenne of Caer, Aerath, and Baron Eamon Lyscaran, deceased on the 6th and 20th day of December, year of our Lord 1136. The parchment trembled between his fingers. The wind roared against the walls, and the candle bent low. For an instant, he thought he heard a voice. Her voice, rising from beyond, whispering through the murmur of the snow. Before the solstice, Eamon. Before the solstice. Chapter 4. Beneath the northern star. Was it a dream, or was he awake? Behind Eamon, the fire had gone out completely. Only the blackened remains of his cloak lay on the floor, twisted and smoking, proof enough that he had not lost his mind. A freezing gust swept through the room, like the sigh of a spirit, stirring the candle flame that still burned on the desk. The light flickered, trembling like a heart unsure between life and death. Eamon bent at once, cupping his hands around it to shield it from the wind. Éirenne's words rang in his mind then, clear as a bell toll in the night. Before the flame goes out, in the last hour of the last day before the winter solstice, you must change your heart, Eamon Lyscaran. The man squeezed his eyes shut, gripped by panic. Do not leave me, Éirenne, he cried, his voice breaking. I beg you. But only the echo of his plea answered him, fading into the murmur of the wind that struck the stained glass. The silence deepened, thickened, until he could hear the faint crackle of melting wax. He stood motionless for a moment, breathing in the scent of smoke and cold stone. A terrible certainty overtook him, the feeling that time was slipping through his fingers. So much to mend, and so little time left to do it. Outside, in the winter night, the chapel bells rang in the distance. Once, twice, 3 times, their sound trailing over the snow. Each toll seemed like the heartbeat of the world, or perhaps, the last echo of his own. The wind rose again, and the flame, which had survived the first assault, wavered once more. Eamon lifted his gaze toward it with a new, almost childlike fear. As if that fragile light held everything that remained of his soul. He stood, unsteady, his face burning with desperation. Before the solstice, he murmured, recalling the spectre's words. Before the flame goes out. He pressed a hand to his chest, as though something still burned there, something he could barely remember. And for the first time in many winters, he truly felt the cold. Chapter 5. Caer, Aerath, Scotland, December 21, 1136. The echo of the solstice. The fire had roused them in the heart of darkness, when the night still refused to die. The flames had roared like beasts, devouring trees and crops, staining the sky with an infernal glow. Yet the castle, by some miracle, still stood. The villagers, blackened by smoke, had worked without rest since dawn. Repairing, rebuilding, praying. Luthan Maelvor, barely 18 winters old, was already as strong as a grown man. He hammered and lifted stones beside the others without complaint. In those harsh lands, no Scot could afford weakness. Yet within him burned something more than fatigue, a restlessness he could not name. He thought of Eluned, his stepmother. She was not his mother by blood, but in every other way she had been. There was always a trace of tenderness in her eyes, a warmth no winter could extinguish. She labored as hard as any man in the clan, perhaps harder. And Brynden, though he had never said it, loved her with the loyalty of a son who clings to his only light. Very different was Seren Brain, wife of Éirenne, lord of those lands. Tall, resolute, her hands always busy, her eyes seeming to judge everything. Since her arrival, She had moved among the men with the authority of one who feared no one. She knew how to braid thatched roofs, design huts, raise walls better than many builders. And she commanded. She commanded with a firm voice that could make even the wind hold its breath. "Take this," she said from the roof, handing him a sealed parchment. "Deliver it to your father." Brynden obeyed reluctantly. He knew his father hated receiving orders, especially from a woman. He wondered, not without bitterness, what kind of clan raised its daughters to rule over men. As he descended the slope with the message, he thought of old Caerwyn, his maternal grandfather. The man lived alone, withdrawn, consumed by bitterness. He had never forgiven Brynden's father for his daughter's death, though their grief bound them closer than either would admit. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the north, Brynden thought he could hear his name whispered through the valley, as if the old man were calling him from his self-imposed exile. Suddenly, the sound of hooves shattered his thoughts. He looked up and saw, in the distance, a group of riders climbing the hill, wrapped in a haze of dust and snow. Their banner, whipping in the storm, bore the head of a wolf. Brynden's heart tightened. He ran to his father and handed him the parchment without a word. "What is this?" his father asked. "From Éirenne," he replied, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. "She says the hearth should stand at the center of the home." His father barely heard him. He tucked the message into his belt and, following the boy's gaze, turned toward the horizon. "Where are your sisters?" "Eluned took them to the brook," Brynden answered. The wind shifted. The wolf banner flared with a sinister gleam. And in that instant, Brynden understood that on that day, the eve of the solstice, more than fire would come to test their souls. By some miracle, the fire had spared most of the village houses, the clan's stronghold, and a few neighboring barns. All the other granaries, save one, had been reduced to ash. For nearly a full week, the clan labored without pause, beneath a strange, almost supernatural warmth for winter days. It was as if the sun, in mercy, had granted them a brief reprieve. From dawn to dusk, men, women, and children toiled through smoke and mud, restoring what the fire had sought to erase. In those harsh lands, no one could afford the luxury of rest or of giving orders from a seat. Brynden knew that well. He had known only one man who lived that way, long ago, in the castle of Eamon Lyscaran. And praise the old gods, he thought. For his stepmother Eluned was nothing like that detestable English lord. Though they shared no blood, Eluned was the light of his life. His father adored her, she, in turn, seemed incapable of harming anyone. She worked harder than any maiden of the Highlands, harder even than some men. Brynden looked up and saw old Torren, once again sitting heavily on his broad backside, drinking shamelessly from his flask of usage. The man possessed an almost miraculous tolerance for Isla's liquor, his wife's fierce brew. He claimed it loosened his joints. Though Brynden was quite certain it loosened his tongue and glued his body to the bench. Luthan Maelvor had grown between two fires, the blood of his father, Luthan Maelvor, laird of the Highlands, and the shadow of his mother, Aili's Caerwyn, daughter of Luthan Caerwyn of Caer Aerath, a man who had died accursed, devoured by his own mistakes. Because of that double inheritance, Maelvor and Caerwyn, Brynden belonged to two of the oldest clans in the north, and his name carried a weight few could grasp. They said that Taran's gaze, his maternal grandfather's eyes, still lived within the boys. That blue that seemed to see what the living could not. The elders swore that in his veins ran the blood of the second line, the ancient kindred who had sworn fealty to Alba's old throne long before Scotland bore a name. It was that blood, more than his sword, that stirred the interest of Baron Eamon Lyscaran. Ambitious and tormented, Lyscaran had heard the whispers at the king's court that there lived a young Highlander whose lineage made him, however distantly, the spiritual heir of the ancient houses, a man who might unite islands and highlands beneath their single banner. To the Baron's eyes, that lineage was a key. If he could win the youth's favor, or use him as a hostage, he might once more draw near to power, perhaps even earn the forgiveness of King David, from whose grace he had fallen. That was why he had the boy taken. Not from hatred or vengeance, but from ambition and despair. Chapter 6. Arrival at Caer Aerath. Finloch Thalana arrived with a score of men to help with the rebuilding. Luthan welcomed him with genuine gratitude. It had been many years since they last met, since the wedding of Finloch's sister, Éirenne, who had fled a fate imposed by King David to marry for love a man of the Brain clan. "I've never liked traveling south," Finloch joked as he dismounted. "And what lies farther north than you?" Luthan retorted. "Only Morven," he answered with a half-smile. They spoke as they climbed the hall's stone steps, the wind whispering through the cracks in the walls. The fortress was alive with people, women lighting fires, men unloading supplies, and Eluned, Luthan's wife, calmly directing everything with tireless composure. "I've heard David has called a council," said Finloch. "Henry's in Normandy, and his barons grow restless. There's movement in Morven. Some say the old Celtic bloodlines might rise again." Luthan nodded, thoughtful. "Then uncertain times are coming." Finloch sighed. "My brother Caer has gone to Edinburgh. If David is planning something, we'll soon know." For a moment, both fell silent, aware of how fragile peace had become. Then Luthan smiled and clapped his friend on the shoulder. "Whatever comes, tonight you'll sleep under my roof. Better crowded than alone on nights like this." Finloch laughed. "I don't fear the cold, old friend, but I'll take your fire and your friendship gladly." At that moment, a joyful voice broke the quiet. "Finloch!" Éirenne Brain ran toward her brother, wrapped in a grey cloak. He opened his arms, and she threw herself into them, laughing with delight. Behind her came Luthan's daughter, Siona, her eyes shining. "Father, more carts have arrived. They bear the banner of Caer Doran." A smile crossed the laird's face. Cian Alderan had come, and with him, perhaps, the fate none of them could yet foresee. Near a bend in the road, the caravan halted. Cian Alderan held the reins of the wagon while his eyes roamed over the cairns scattered across the hills, stone mounds raised for the dead. Among them lay the memory of his clan, the lives lost, the names he himself had carved into the stone. He looked back at the wagon where his children sat nestled among blankets and provisions. Tyrion, the eldest, entertained her younger siblings with stories and games. Ira, the youngest, was the living image of her mother, with red hair and green eyes. None of them knew the full story of their family, the fire and blood Cian had left behind. Alanna, his wife, sat beside him, as serene as ever. Seeing the shadow in his eyes, she gently took his arm. "If you ever wish to tell them the truth, we'll do it together," she said. Cian nodded in silence. Perhaps what mattered was not how his kin had died, but what still lived within them. As they moved along the snow-covered path, he thought of Luthan, his old laird and friend, and of the years that had drifted between them. He felt grateful, though wary, like a man who had survived too many winters. Alanna drew her cloak tighter and smiled, tired, but steadfast. "All will be well, Cian Alderan," she whispered. He looked at her, and in that moment he understood that his home was not the ruins awaiting him, but the hands resting beside his own. Chapter 7. Eve of the winter solstice. It was the longest night of the year, when the earth seemed to forget the light and the sky folded in upon itself. On the open field, the fire burned like a prayer to Cailleach Bua, the mother of winter, blue-faced and ancient of heart. They said that when she walked with her ash staff, the frost cracked beneath her feet. Yet she also shielded men from the northern winds. That night they honored her, begging her to hold back the snows until the new houses could rise. Luthan Maelvor oversaw the great pit where the pig was roasting, ringed with stones and ash. The heat of the fire lit the faces of men and women who had come from afar, gathered not for celebration but remembrance. Amid the smoke, the air smelled of meat and resin, and for a moment it seemed that darkness had made peace with life. Cian Aldarine arrived with his people, bringing provisions and a wary smile. Beside him walked his wife, Alanna, and behind them their children, laughing among the shadows. For folk who had once lived as enemies, such a gesture of generosity was a miracle. Luthan embraced them one by one, his emotion plain to see. "By God, Cian," he said hoarsely, "I'm glad to see you." "Och, man, did you think we'd leave you alone?" "What's mine is yours," Cian replied, gripping his arm. They both laughed, easing the scars of the past with humor. Around the fire, the clans mingled, the Maelvors, the Brains, the Montwerns. Torren, the old musician, played his flute. Its melody rose between the laughter of children and the distant rhythm of a hammer striking in the night. Eluned, her face lit by the flames, made her way through the crowd. Her skirt was stained with earth and flour, yet she moved with natural grace. "Cian Aldarine, welcome," she called. He embraced her warmly. "There's no accent sweeter than yours, Eluned," he teased. She laughed, answering in kind. "Only if you've come without your fleas. You'll never forgive me for that, will you?" "Never," she said, laughing with a mischievous sparkle in her eyes. Her laughter melted into the cold air as Cian answered with the warmth of an old friend. "And Alanna?" asked Eluned. "With the little ones," he replied. "She'll come down soon. Tell her I'll be waiting," she said, turning toward the fire. Luthan approached and brushed a hand through her hair with tenderness. "There's no better complaint than this, my love," he murmured. Cian watched them with quiet envy. "Your children must have grown into giants," said Eluned. "Like weeds," Cian laughed, "though none as tall as that one there." His eyes settled on a group of young people by the fire. Among them, Brynden Maelvor stood apart, his face turned toward the shadows. Beside him, Lyanna laughed with Cormac Thalana, a boy of dark eyes and noble bearing. Luthan followed his friend's gaze and sighed. "I don't know what to do with him," he admitted. Eluned laid a hand on his arm. "We'll find our way, Luthan," she said softly. Cian frowned. "What troubles the boy?" Luthan stared into the embers. "An old wound," he said. "One that doesn't bleed, but won't let him sleep." The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of snow and damp wood. The fire crackled as though some ancient shadow had drawn near from the mountains, unseen, yet present, reminding them that the night was not yet over. Chapter 8. Solstice Dawn. As the first light of dawn crept over the hills, the fire of the great, sacred post began to die down slowly. Yet the sound of hammers did not cease, a stubborn rhythm that seemed to keep the land itself alive. Brynden Maelvor stood apart from the others, his gaze fixed on the dying embers. How many fires like this had he seen burn since he was born? Thousands, perhaps. And yet, this one felt different. Never before had a fire brought them misfortune. Not even during that dry summer when the crops withered and the earth cracked. His people had always known how to master the flames. But that night, something had changed. While the others laughed, sharing stories and wine, he felt apart from everyone. As if an invisible cold kept him separated from the world. Something gnawed at his thoughts, a warning that seemed to rise from his bones. His grandmother called it the gift of vision, though sometimes it felt like a curse. Since childhood, he had felt that shiver before danger, like the time he dreamed of a woman weeping over a blood-stained cloth, and Lysander died that very afternoon, choking on a bone. No one believed him then, but he knew what he saw was real. He lifted his eyes. Amid the shadows of the fire, he recognized familiar faces, Seren Brain. So devoted to her husband it was almost uncomfortable to watch them. Thomason of Montwern. Rounder and happier than ever, laughing as he played with the children, and Sian Aldaran. Steady and noble, talking with Luthan by the pit. Brynden watched them with a somber affection. He loved his people, but he feared for them. Happiness, he knew, attracted ghosts just as much as despair. He turned his gaze to the youths. His cousin Lyanna was flirting with Cormac Thalana, the son of the Lord of Dub Khan. Dark-eyed and dark-haired, Cormac spoke in a deep voice, inventing mountains and lakes to make her laugh. Our house rises over the water, he said. A cranog. The waves never reach us. And you sleep without fear of falling into the lake, she asked, fascinated. Never. We've lived this way for generations, Cormac replied proudly. Brynden snorted softly, amused and annoyed at the same time. He settled in the shadows, outside the firelight, keeping watch. Not out of jealousy, but instinct. Someone had to look after Lyanna, he thought, even if she didn't know it. The wind rose, carrying the scent of smoke and frost. Torrin's flute had long gone silent, and the laughter faded among the blankets and shadows. One by one, the clans surrendered to sleep. Brynden rested his head against a log, determined to stay awake. The sky, moonless, stretched like a dark well where the stars seemed to drown. Only a faint glow remained from the fire, flickering like a heart that refused to die. Just a moment, he told himself, letting fatigue take him. And so, with the snow suspended in the air like held breath, Luthan Maelvor closed his eyes, unaware that sleep would carry him to a place where the dead still remembered the fire. Chapter 9. December 22nd, 1136. Dawn rose over a landscape shrouded in smoke and silence. The great fire from the previous night was now little more than a bed of ash and embers, faintly pulsing under the dew. Luthan Maelvor awoke with a start. For a moment he didn't know where he was, or why the air smelled of burnt wood and cold iron. He brought a hand to his forehead, realizing he had slept by the fire, and that he was the first to wake. The thought did not cheer him, though it comforted him to see that everything still stood. The tents, the sleeping bodies, the hills beyond the valley. Around him, the ground was a mosaic of sprawled figures, wrapped in singed tartans and dry leaves. They looked like fallen soldiers, yet they breathed peacefully, their faces red from the cold, mouths slightly open. A sea of dreams. He searched for Lyanna among the bodies, and when he did not see her, he sighed in relief. Perhaps she had had the good sense to go sleep under shelter. Good girl, he thought, hoping it was so. He rose slowly, rubbing his eyes. The mist hovering over the plain was thick, more fog than smoke, and the rising sun slowly tore it apart, revealing a landscape he did not recognize. He stood still. What he saw could not be real. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. No. Impossible. And yet, there they were, where only wooden skeletons and half-built roofs had risen the night before. Now stretched a fully formed village, rows of cabins with freshly joined walls, thatched roofs gleaming, smoke curling from lit chimneys. The place breathed life. For a moment, he thought some spirit had transported him far away, or that he was still dreaming inside another's dream. Still disbelieving, he moved among the sleeping bodies, stepping over arms and legs until he reached Torrin, lying with his head on a log and one hand clutching his USG bottle. Brynden passed around him in silence and continued toward the nearest cabin, mouth ajar, fearing that if he spoke, it would all vanish. It's just a dream, he whispered. What did you say? Murmured Torrin without opening his eyes, groping for the bottle. Brynden said nothing. He approached the nearest wall and pressed both hands against the wood. It was warm, solid, alive. It could not be the work of tired, drunken men. The night before, the beams had barely risen from the ground. Exclamations rose behind him. "By all the saints!" grunted Torren, now awake. "Do you see that? The houses. They've risen on their own." "It's a gift from the Caerleech," shouted someone. The crowd began to stretch and look, incredulous, at the rows of new houses spreading to the horizon. Some laughed, others crossed themselves. Brynden remained motionless, his heart beating slowly, as if expecting to hear something from inside the walls. A sigh, a whisper, the echo of invisible hands that had worked through the night. The joy of the others did not reach him. Something in that miracle chilled his blood. For the gifts of the Caerleech, he knew well, never came without a price. And as the sun pushed through the morning mist, Brynden completely forgot his cousin and ran toward the fortress, with the premonition that his father had already felt the same shiver. Chapter 10. The Great Hall of Caer. Never had the Great Hall of the castle held so many people, not even during the trials. From the days, Luthan Maelvor watched the expectant faces of his men, the torches flickering against the walls, the shadows stretching across the beams like omens. At his feet, Brynden, his eldest, stood rigid, eyes fixed on the hearth flames, darker than ever. "There's no proof the fire was set on purpose, son," said Luthan, his deep voice echoing among the stone pillars. "And if someone did, why would they burn the village only to rebuild it overnight?" Brynden shook his head slowly, his expression hardening. "I don't know, father, but I feel it in my bones. Something isn't right." A murmur rippled through the hall, broken by Torren's insolent laughter. Luthan silenced him with a glare. Quiet returned like a shroud. The young man's voice rose, trembling with anger. "You mock me, but I can sense it. Evil walks our lands." Luthan sighed. His son had always lived beneath the weight of an ancient distrust, a shadow inherited. Since childhood, he'd seen enemies in every corner of the forest and spirits in every gust of wind. Some said he had the sight, like old Branna. But Luthan knew the sight was no gift. It was a wound. "No one has seen anything," the laird said, raising his voice to the crowd. There were murmurs of denial. Only Branna, the old woman, dared to lift her hand. "It was the work of the Bochen Sabhale, my lord," she said. "The barn sprites, the night repairers." Luthan closed his eyes, wary. He did not believe in sprites. Yet the mystery burned in his chest. The fire had devoured the village. And still, by dawn, the houses stood rebuilt, every stone in its place, every beam new. As if unseen hands had labored under the moon. Before he could answer, a guard burst through the crowd, dragging with him his niece Lyanna. The girl's hair was tangled with straw, and the blush of her shame was visible even in torchlight. "Laird," said the guard, "we found her in the barn, with young Cormac Thalana." A cold murmur swept the hall. Luthan clenched his jaw. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice low. "We were only sleeping," Lyanna stammered, weeping. The girl's reputation hung by an invisible thread, more fragile than the smoke rising from the hearth. Luthan looked at Cormac, the boy who, despite everything, did not avert his gaze. "Your age?" he asked. 16 winters, my lord." Luthan nodded slowly. In the silence that followed, the wind's moan through the battlements could be heard, as if the entire castle held its breath. "Everyone out," he ordered, his voice ringing like a strike of iron. Brynden did not move. "Father, let me at least search the woods," he pleaded. "Something dark is out there, I swear it." Luthan looked at him with wariness and sorrow. "My son, let it rest for tonight. Do not summon more ghosts." The young man bowed his head, but his eyes burned with restrained fire. When he left, Luthan felt the weight of legacy settle on him like a cold stone. His son saw shadows, and perhaps, he thought with a shiver, not all of them were imagined. Then silence fell once more over the hall. And as the rain struck the windows, Cormac spoke with trembling resolve. "I love her," he said, "and I will wed her this very night, if you permit it." The torches flickered, and for an instant, Luthan swore he saw within the flames a face that should not have been there. That of his late wife, watching him with infinite sorrow. Chapter 11. The Joining of Hands. Great divinities who shape and guard life, grant your blessing on this day of grace, murmured old Branna, her voice echoing through the stone walls like a forgotten prayer. A sea of faces watched the young couple. Finlock stood apart, his face bathed in the uncertain glow of the torches, while his son Cormac, so proud, so young still, spoke his vows. Ah, if only Ailís had been there, he thought. His wife would have smiled, she would have wept too, with that sweet and terrible way women have when they sense that happiness will not last. The girl, Lyanna, was barely past childhood. In a blue gown with sprigs of sage in her hair, she seemed more an apparition than a bride. Cormac looked at her as though the whole world began and ended in her eyes. Finlock watched them with tenderness and a faint tremor of fear. Love, when it is that pure, always foretells a loss. "Join hands," ordered Branna. The two young ones obeyed with trembling fervor. The old woman took a bundle of ribbons and began to tie them around their joined wrists. The gesture, repeated for generations, seemed to contain centuries of faith and superstition. Each knot was a vow, each color, an invisible thread between the living and the dead. "Do you come of your own will to seal this union?" "Yes," they both answered, and their unison reply stirred a murmur among those gathered. Finlock bowed his head for a moment. That hurried ceremony reminded him of his own with Ailís, beneath another moon, another winter, and the same fire in the heart. "Will you honor each other in sorrow and in joy?" Branna continued. "Yes." "Will you remain faithful to one another, while your hands, though wrinkled and weak, still seek each other in the dark?" "Yes," they whispered. The final knot was tied, and silence thickened, deep as the snow waiting beyond the walls. "Then may the gods look upon you with kindness," the old woman concluded. "Cormac, you may kiss your wife." The boy hesitated for an instant, glancing at his father, at the lairds, at the restrained crowd. Then he leaned forward, with the awkward grace of one who loves for the first time, and barely brushed the girl's face. Everyone laughed, even Finlock. A fleeting moment of warmth amid the chill of the solstice. Afterward, as music rose and laughter filled the hall, Finlock turned to his sister Éirenne. "She's a beautiful girl," she murmured. "Yes," he replied, taking her arm. "And even more beautiful is the faith with which she looks at him." Éirenne smiled, the fire reflected in her eyes. "Do not fear, brother. Your son has inherited the best of you." But Finlock did not answer, for at the far end of the hall, among the shadows dancing across the stone, he thought he saw a figure, tall, still, wrapped in a glow that did not come from the fire. His heart gave a jolt. It looked like Ailís. A breath of icy air swept through the room, extinguishing one of the altar candles. And while the guests clapped and the young couple walked through petals of flowers, Finlock knew, as only those who have truly loved can know, that death does not always cease to attend weddings. Chapter 12. The Night of the Solstice. The fire cast burning embers into the sky, like blazing souls seeking paradise. They said the winter solstice was a time of rebirth and penance, when the veil between the living and the dead grew thin as breath in the frozen air. The old spoke of judgments and wandering fae, of spirits come to claim what the year owed them. The young, less believing, simply called it the longest night. Ruach smiled in the half-light. The fire consuming the hills was no divine punishment, but his own design. He had set those flames not to destroy, but to draw them in. Had he wished to annihilate them, they would have perished in their sleep. But no. He already carried too many souls on his conscience. And tonight, one would be enough. Hours earlier, within the walls of the great hall, he had remained hidden. A stranger among his own blood. He had heard the laird's son warn that something was amiss, and for a moment he feared everything would unravel. But old Maelvor had dismissed it, drowning suspicion beneath music and wine. The feast went on, obscene and merry, as though the flames that had devoured half the village the week before were but a bad dream. The pride of the Highlanders, Ruach thought, was as vast as their ignorance. For a fleeting instant, just one, he felt remorse. But these were not his people. If fate were reversed, they would not hesitate to hang him from an oak and leave the crows to their work. Loyalty, in these lands, was bought with fear and paid in blood. And he had already chosen his side, or at least, the most convenient one. Eluned. Did she truly believe her father's coldness was reserved only for her? No. Like the other bastards, he had always been treated as a servant, given orders without a glance. Yet that indifference was his greatest ally. Eamon Lyscaran never read his letters. And so he still ignored the one thing that mattered most. Everything was unfolding as planned. Among the crowd, old men, youths, soldiers, maidens, Ruach moved unseen. The smoke of heather, the scent of peat and usage, wrapped around him like a spell. No one noticed the man who belonged to no clan. No one saw the blade beneath his cloak. As the pipers struck up an ancient air, Ruach thought of his purpose. With the death of King Henry Beauclerc, the fair scribe, poisoned, the whispers said, the kingdoms were splitting like thawing ice. Winds of war blew from the south, carrying rumors of treachery and ambition. In England, Stephen of Blois now claimed the throne. In Scotland, David gathered his armies. And between the two crowns stretched an invisible board, where every life, every love, every lineage, was but a piece to be sacrificed. If Eluned died, her bloodline would die with her. And then, when all burned and the world was stripped of names, Ruach would claim what had always been his. The air filled with music, laughter, and spilled wine. The newlyweds passed by dancing, hands entwined, faces glowing in the firelight. Ruach lifted his oak horn in a feigned toast. Long live the bride and groom, he shouted, with a smile that never reached his eyes. The young bride, radiant, leaned toward him and brushed his cheek with a warm kiss. How easy, he thought. How delightfully easy. With a single stroke, he could end both father and daughter, and winter would bury it all. A charming couple, wouldn't you say? Said a voice beside him. Ruach turned. The man wore a dark blue mantle, a lion embroidered on his chest, Thomason of Montwern, the lion. At his side, his wife, beautiful as an omen, watched him with the distance of one who knows she lives only on borrowed time. Indeed, my lord, Ruach replied, modulating his voice to mask his Norman tongue. To you and your lady, my health, he added, raising his cup again. Montwern smiled, though his eyes clouded with a hint of suspicion. Ruach drank a long draught of usage, the only true gift of these lands, and stepped back slowly into the crowd, waiting for the moment when fate would deign to call him by name. The fire crackled higher, and for a moment, in the red reflection of the flames, he thought he saw his mother's face. She did not reproach him. She only looked at him, as if she already knew that, before the night was over, the darkness would come again to claim what the solstice had promised to return. Chapter 13. Brynden's suspicion. Amid laughter and wine, Brynden's warnings faded like smoke over the snow. He was not so much angry as deeply frustrated. He understood that his father had reason to doubt his instincts, but he, for his part, had his own reasons to feel the cold weight of foreboding. He had been nearly a prisoner in a war not his own, and his current freedom owed more to the greed of Eluned's father than to any man's mercy. That lord had chosen to serve the king rather than protect his own blood. His father used to say, "If you don't fight for those you love, then who in hell would you fight for, my son?" And yet, Eluned had never spoken a bitter word against her father. Brynden had spent enough time at Caer Aerath to know that Eamon Lyscaran barely regarded her as his daughter. He made her sit on the lower benches of the great hall, while he, the enemy's son, shared bread and table beside that man cold as a river stone. Eluned received the scraps, and still, she smiled. Even as a child, Brynden had pitied that calm-eyed girl who wandered the castle corridors like a soul without a master. He turned and saw her now, holding her father's hand as they withdrew together from the revelry. A faint smile, a crack of tenderness across his face, passed over Brynden's features. Seeing them happy, even for an instant, gave him a strange peace. But it also freed him. With his father's attention fixed on Eluned, he could follow his own instinct. He needed no men, no permission. The forest, the night, and his unease were enough. For there was something in that fire that would not let him rest. It could have been chance, the wind, a stray spark, but the flames had stopped exactly where they should not have. Had the fire spread in another direction, it would have consumed the lands of 3 neighboring clans, the Caerwyn, the Brynden, and the Montwern, and the devastation would have been complete. But it hadn't. The woods had been spared, untouched and silent, as if an unseen hand had shielded them. Too much luck, Brynden thought. And in these lands, luck was seldom innocent. The day before, he had examined the edges of the blaze. The ashes formed a straight, precise line, almost drawn. It was no work of chance. Something, or someone, had decided how far the fire should burn. His father could think what he pleased. This had nothing to do with outsiders or broken alliances. There was something deeper, something that breathed among the trees, watching him whenever he looked toward the forest. With or without blessing, Brynden meant to uncover the truth. As dusk fell and the sky blackened over the hills, the glow of the fire painting the walls in spectral red, he slipped out of the dun, leaving behind the music, the laughter, and the wine. The wind smelled of peat and destiny. He remembered Branna's words, the old wise woman's counsel. Follow your instinct when the light fades, for that is when the dead speak clearest. And he obeyed. He entered the forest. Silence wrapped around him like a promise. In the distance, the echo of the feast faded completely, and only the crunch of frost beneath his boots remained, and the unseen pulse of something waiting for him among the trees. Chapter 14. The Fire and the Snow. Mo Dween, she whispered, her voice sweet as honey. My man. Luthan placed a finger on her lips, afraid that any word might break the moment. Shh, Mo Gride, he murmured. Say nothing. In the trembling firelight, Eluned seemed suspended beyond time. Not a single strand of grey dimmed the pale gold of her hair. The flame's glow danced upon her skin like the reflection of ancient days. It was as though the passing years had forgotten her, as though winter had never dared to rest upon her. Luthan watched her in silence, feeling the tender weight of memory. The girl he had found in the rain, drenched and laughing. The woman who had given him a home, a united clan, and the warmth of a daughter with the same bright gaze. Eluned had been his refuge, his faith, his music. And yet, deep in his chest, something dark still pulsed, the name of her father, old Eamon Lyscaran, and the wound they had never learned to heal. She looked at him, reading the thought before he spoke. Luthan, she said softly, we cannot keep fleeing from the living as if we were already ghosts. He smiled with sadness. No one will notice our absence. All eyes are on Lyanna and Cormac. And still, the past watches us, she whispered. There was a brief silence. Then Eluned lifted her hand and brushed his cheek. The gesture half caress, half farewell. Promise me that tonight you will let peace into your heart, she asked. Before winter seals it completely. Luthan bowed his head, catching her hand between his own. Seol Mo cried, he said in a broken voice. Music of my heart. What if it's already too late? She smiled. That smile of hers that hurt more than any wound. It's never too late for those who still remember how to love. Then the wind slipped through the cracks of the stable, snuffing out a candle. The shadows stretched long, and for an instant, Luthan thought his wife's face faded among them, as if she were only an echo, a memory caught in the smoke. He called her name, but no answer came. Only the murmur of distant bells, announcing the arrival of the longest night of the year. Chapter 15. The scent of winter. And you, the one of my heart, whispered Eluned, barely a breath, answering the old tongue with a tremor that ran through her from head to toe. For an instant, all the weight of the world seemed to fade away. The cold of the floor, the smell of hay, the distant murmur of wind among the stables. None of it existed beyond the warmth of Luthan's hands. Around them, life went on. The banquet, the laughter, the preparations, but there, within the shadows and the soft steam of the stable, time itself stood still. Luthan knew her better than anyone. The way he touched her was that of a man brushing against an ancient promise, a spell made flesh. Eluned gave herself to him with the luminous docility of someone who, for a heartbeat, became again the girl who had once waited in the rain for her reluctant knight. For a moment, there were no duties, no clans, no ruins to rebuild, only the whisper of wind and two hearts beating as one. This is what life should be, thought Eluned, with an almost childlike smile. This is what is worth remembering. She did not care for the cold, nor the hardness of the floor, nor the smell of sleeping beasts. The stable, with its warm dusk and its tar-scented wooden beams, felt to her like a sanctuary. But suddenly, another scent slipped between the smoke and the straw. It was not dung, nor hay. It was something sweet, out of place, impossible. Cinnamon, ginger, lavender, and a faint trace of clove, like the confections made only for sacred days. Eluned frowned, lifting her head slightly. Luthan. Her voice sounded strange, barely a broken breath. The man froze at once, as if her tone had chilled the air itself. What is it? Mo cried. Have you ordered the provisions to be stored here? She asked, glancing toward the darkness. No, he replied, surprised. The storehouse is still locked. Eluned rose slowly. The dimness had thickened, and the distant flame of a lantern flickered at the stable door, casting shadows that didn't seem to belong to them. She felt her heart tighten in her chest. There was something, a presence, a silence, that was not of this world. Luthan, she whispered, light a lamp. Now, he asked, torn between disbelief and unease. But there was no time for more. A metallic sound split the air, brief, sharp, final. The crack of iron sinking into bone. And before Eluned could understand what was happening, Luthan's body collapsed onto her, heavy, still warm, exhaling a groan that blended with the distant lowing of the cattle. For an instant, she thought the whole world had stopped. Luthan, she cried, struggling beneath his weight, her hands searching desperately for a wound she could not find. Luthan, answer me. Then the scent changed. The perfume of spices mixed with something older, blood and iron, sweet and terrible. And amid the half-light, a voice, serene, almost pious, whispered from the shadows. Love, my lady, burns like fire. and every fire must one day consume its own flame. Eluned lifted her gaze, her breath frozen on her lips. At the stable's entrance, a figure dressed in dark watched her, eyes glowing like embers in the gloom. The solstice had begun. Chapter 16. The Son of Winter. Any trace of modesty Eluned might have felt at being caught with her husband vanished the moment she saw Luthan lying face down on the straw, motionless. The blow had been brutal. The man in the shadows had struck him down with a single stab to the head, and before Eluned could react, a rough hand seized her arm and dragged her out of the stable. She screamed, struggled, but the stranger shoved her into the darkness with the strength of someone well accustomed to commanding the lives of others. Unlike the previous night, the settlement was silent. Luthan had declared that day one of rest and gratitude. Everyone was gathered around the great solstice fire, half a league away, where the flames danced beneath the black sky to keep the old spirits at bay. "We can't leave him there," Eluned sobbed, trying to turn back toward the stable. The stranger, cloaked in the red tartan of the Caerwyn, twisted her arm with such violence that a cry escaped her throat. "He'll be fine," he said, not even looking at her. "I only struck him. But if you make me go back, I swear he'll never rise again." Eluned felt a fleeting relief that turned at once to horror. "You've no idea what you've done. When Luthan wakes, he'll come for me. And he'll find you." She regretted the words instantly. The man turned slightly, his voice cold with mockery. "He won't find me until it's too late." "Too late," she whispered. The man's tone was strange, his accent indefinable, not wholly Scots, nor English either, but a discordant mixture that sounded vaguely familiar, like an echo from the past. "Your father will kill you," he said with dreadful calm. Eluned froze, uncomprehending. "My father? Eamon Lyscaran." The name struck like a blade. "Eamon is here?" she asked, incredulous. "Aye," the man repeated. "With you?" "Not exactly. Has he come to kill me?" The stranger smiled in the dimness. "Does it matter?" "Of course it matters." Eluned burst out, her voice breaking between fury and fear. How could she imagine that her own father would wish her dead? Eamon Lyscaran had never loved her, but to kill her. And yet, deep down, she knew he was capable of anything. He had cast her out without remorse, denied her name, and only later, when it was already too late, had he wanted her back. But why now? What could he gain from her death? "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor running through her. "Someone with a legitimate interest," he replied, with a smile she could not see but could feel. That accent, she remembered it. One of the kitchen maids at Caer Aerath had spoken the same way. Her father used to jest with her far too often, with the vulgarese of men who hold power. "Bring me sweets to my chamber," he'd say, and the woman obeyed. Only now, in the darkness, did Eluned grasp the true meaning of those visits. And she remembered, too, that the woman had a son. A boy a little older than she, with cold eyes and a stone smile. One day, he had vanished without a word. Eluned's heart clenched. "I know who you are," she said in a trembling whisper. The man yanked her forward with greater force. "Be silent," he ordered. But fear had already given way to fury. Eluned straightened as much as she could, searching for any sign of light. A glimmer from the distant fire. The silhouette of a rider on the hill. Nothing. Only the forest and the fog. Far away, the laughter of the festival was just a murmur drowned by the wind. Luthan had not left the stable. No one had heard her cry. The silence was so heavy that even her own breath felt foreign. "God help me," she thought, "if Brynden or Éirenne find my father before I do." Terror coursed through her like an icy current. If Luthan's men saw Eamon Lyscaran on these lands, they would kill him before he could speak. "What makes you think you can escape?" Eluned said, with desperate courage. "Be silent," he repeated, his voice now a growl. The forest closed around them. The bare branches creaked like old bones, and the moon, veiled by mist, looked like a silver coin sunk in water. The air smelled of lavender, cinnamon, and clove, the same scents that had haunted her since childhood, the same that now marked her doom. Each step carried them farther from fire and men, every shadow seemed alive. Eluned then understood that fear was a form of clarity. She drew a deep breath, gathered what strength remained, and turned sharply, raising her voice into the night. "Father," she cried, "Eamon Lyscaran, come to me." Her voice rang like a bell through the trees. The echo bounced through the thicket, multiplied by the fog, until it seemed a multitude of voices called her own name in return. And in that instant, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Only the crunch of snow beneath their feet broke the silence. The man stopped, his breath caught in his throat. Eluned felt, more than heard, another sound. The thud of hooves, a whisper, and a voice, distant, rising from the wind of the north. Eluned. Chapter 17. The fire that must not be extinguished. Half of Eamon's men had already departed, vanishing into the morning mist. The other half were gathering the last of their belongings from the camp, while old Lyscaran, standing apart from the group, unfastened his belt to relieve himself one last time before leaving. There was no reason to linger any longer. Those woods were not safe. Rumors whispered that a young Scot, Brynden Maelvor, the laird's son, was roaming nearby. If that boy found them, he would soon trace their path back to their refuge, and then all their effort would be lost. Despite his wariness, Eamon felt an odd sense of satisfaction. The fire of the great, sacred post, that flame that must not die before the solstice, still burned in the distance. Just as Éirenne had promised, he had done his part. Yes, he thought, that must be what she had meant. Not to let the flame die before he had redeemed his guilt. The night before, under the winter moon, they had worked in secret. His men, cloaked in tartans stolen from the Caerwyn, had crossed the valley and finished rebuilding the village while the villagers slept, exhausted from the feast. Eamon himself had placed the offerings in the Laird Maelvor's stable, loaves of bread, cloth, new tools, even a small silver cross he had crafted with his own hands. Everything he could give. He hoped Eluned would find them, that she would finally understand that her father, even from the shadows, had tried to mend the irreparable. "May Éirenne see what I've done for our daughter," he murmured, lifting his gaze to the overcast sky. The wind gave him only the sigh of the trees in return. And then he heard it. "Eamon Lyscaran," cried a woman's voice from the thicket. His heart stopped. Éirenne? Had she returned once more, wrapped in her blue light? He stood motionless, his tunic falling over his boots, his hands trembling with shock. The night was sealed, no moon, no spectral glow. But the voice had been real. Too real. Then, with the clarity of a prayer, came another word. "Father." That was no spirit's voice. It was Eluned's. His daughter's. Eamon's heart filled with desperate hope. Perhaps she had found the gifts. Perhaps she had understood his intent and come to forgive him before his departure. He ran toward the sound, stumbling through roots and branches, his breath short, his soul trembling between remorse and longing. But soon he realized, with a chill, that Eluned's cries were not of joy. They were of fear. The air smelled of iron and smoke, and in the distance came the echo of a struggle, a muffled gasp. Eamon froze, strung his bow, and fitted an arrow. His old hands trembled, but his gaze was that of a hunter. He took another step forward, until the shadows parted before him. And then he saw him. "Ruach," he whispered, in disbelief. The man holding Eluned by the arm turned slowly. His face was hardened, his eyes pale as ice, and the tartan of the Caerwyn draped his shoulders. "Greetings, father," he said with a smile that was anything but human. For a moment, the whole forest seemed to hold its breath. The solstice flame flickered in the distance, and Éamon felt Éirenne's prophecy unfolding before his eyes. Before the flame is extinguished, the fire of repentance, the fire of love, the fire of blood, all burned now in the same night. Chapter 18. The Bow of Destiny. Brynden had barely entered the forest when he saw it. Between trunks silvered with frost, a man's figure emerged from the mist, faint, luminous, as if the moon itself had taken human form. The elders said the solstice was the hour between worlds, when the veil separating life and death grew thin enough for creatures of the other realm to walk among men. He had heard tales of banshees weeping omens, of wandering lights that led the living to their doom. But this man neither wept nor floated. He walked slowly, dreamlike, and lifted a hand, beckoning him to follow. Brynden didn't think. He plunged after him, running through pines and beeches draped in lichen. The air smelled of snow and iron. They crossed a stream, its surface reflecting the spectre's glow. And on the other side he realized they had entered Caerwyn lands. He stopped for a moment, breathing deeply. There was something familiar about that face, but he couldn't name it until the spirit turned toward him. Standing in a clearing where the paths diverged, one leading to Brynden, the other to the hill where his grandfather's house still stood. He hadn't set foot there in years. Luthan Caerwyn, the old laird, had never been an easy man to love. And yet, there he was, standing tall, young again, his grandfather's blue eyes fixed on him with an intensity that pierced the air. No sound came from his lips, yet Brynden heard his voice within him, like a thought that wasn't his own. "I'm sorry, boy." And in that inner whisper came everything else: remorse, late tenderness, the love he had never known how to show. "Forgive the ruin I made of your mother and father. I wish I had known your kindness in life. Now I will guard you, but to do so, you must see what I see." A shiver ran through Brynden, but not of fear. A deep, almost sacred calm enveloped him, until a scream tore through the night. Taran's spectre turned toward the sound, his eyes suddenly alight, and raised a finger pointing toward the valley. Then his form dissolved into a pale mist that the wind carried away among the trees. Brynden drew his sword. The metal hissed in the darkness like a streak of ice. Without hesitation, he ran, moving between trunks with silent steps, his heartbeat drumming in his temples. The cry came again, closer this time. It was no cry of joy or pleasure. It was a cry for help. The young man crouched behind a pine, and saw it. In the clearing, beneath the dim light of the moon, a man was aiming a bow. His chainmail glinted between the shadows. An Englishman, Brynden thought instinctively. The archer's stance was steady, his eyes fixed on a target across the clearing. Brynden followed the line of the bow, and what he saw froze his blood. Eamon Lyscaran, Eluned's father. And facing him, his own stepmother, struggling against another man who held her fast. For a moment, everything stopped. The air, time, even thought itself. Then instinct took over. Brynden didn't reason. He lunged like a wolf onto Lyscaran's back, and the blade sank into flesh with a dull, heavy sound of bone and metal. He felt the body shudder beneath his hands. But it was too late. The bow had already loosed. The arrow hissed through the dark, a line of fire slicing the air. Eluned's scream split the silence. Brynden looked up just in time to see. The arrow was not meant for her, but for the man holding her. The impact was brutal. The stranger collapsed without a sound, his arms releasing the woman, who fell to her knees beside her father's bleeding body. Éamon still breathed, blood darkening his chest, his eyes fixed on his daughter's face. Eluned screamed again, not in fear or rage, but with a grief so deep, It seemed torn from the heart of the world. Brynden stood frozen, sword in hand, unable to grasp what he had done. The wind moved through the trees, and the moon, hidden for a moment, shone once more upon the scene. Snow began to fall, slow, silent, covering the bodies in a pale shroud. And in that mortal stillness, Brynden thought he heard a sigh. A voice descending with the mist, soft and distant. Before the flame is extinguished. The young man looked up. Among the trees, a blue light floated, dancing like a lost soul. And he knew then that winter had not yet claimed its final victim. Only later, when he saw the face of the dead man at Eluned's feet, did he understand everything. The arrow had been Eamon's, and it had pierced the skull of the bastard Ruark, the unacknowledged son, born of sin and silence. The man Brynden had wounded by mistake was no enemy, but the father of the woman he loved. The father who, in his final act, had saved his daughter from the living fruit of his own guilt. Chapter 19. The Flame and the Return. "Papa," whispered Eluned through her sobs. Eamon heard it as if from far away, through the murmur of the forest and the dull drumming of his own blood spilling onto the cold earth. The pain was faint, distant, as if it no longer belonged to him. He knew his arrow had struck its mark. To his final breath, his aim had never failed him. Even when his legs trembled and his belly weighed heavier than his pride. The bow had always been his truth, his voice. "Papa," Eluned said again, her voice breaking, her trembling hands pressed against his chest. Eamon looked at her with tenderness. He had always loved her boundless heart. Her way of giving herself even when love was not returned. Éirenne had been the same. His Éirenne, radiant to the end. His vision was fading, but he wanted to see her clearly one last time. His daughter. His only one, the woman who had bloomed among ruins. It wasn't meant to end this way. He had only ever wanted to protect her. Éirenne had promised him he would have a chance to atone. Hadn't she said that? Then the forest filled with a soft, growing blue light, and Eamon understood at last. The chance was not for him. It was for her. For those who would come after. For his bloodline. His part of the bargain was the end. And yet, he felt no fear. Only a sweet, enveloping cold, as if the snow itself were embracing him. Through the shadows, he saw another pair of eyes, clear, startled, appear over his daughter's shoulder. "Brynden," he murmured, recognizing in the young man's face the child who had once played upon his knees. A faint smile crossed his lips. "You're a good lad," he managed to say. Those were his last words. "Hold on, Papa," cried Eluned, choked with tears. "Brynden, run. Run to fetch Luthan. He's in the stable. Hurry." The world was growing blurry, like a fogged mirror. Eamon's breath echoed in his head, slow and hollow like a distant drum. He heard the young man's footsteps fading away, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. And he knew the hourglass was emptying. With effort, he tried to pull the ring from his swollen finger. He had no gold, no land, no power to give his daughter. Only what was hers by right, the seal of Caer Aerath. With numbed fingers, he slid it free and, without speaking, placed it in Eluned's palm. He tried to speak, but a thread of blood sealed his lips. "No, no, no," she sobbed, shaking her head. "Papa, oh, Papa, I love you." Eamon heard her say it once, then again, and again. "I love you." A litany carved into his soul. And he understood it was true. That she still loved him, despite everything. Despite the years, the sins, the distance. He wanted to answer, but the words refused to take form. "I love you too," he thought, and closed his eyes. Then he remembered Éirenne's voice. "You will know love when it is returned to you." And as he exhaled his final breath, Eamon's heart burst with a deep, radiant joy. the cold vanished. He was home again, before the fire. The room glowed with a golden light, and the air smelled of wine, of wood, of life. Éirenne waited for him by the hearth, dressed in her red velvet mantle. His own cloak draped over her shoulders. Her smile outshone the flames. "You did not die alone," she said, her voice sounding like music in Eamon's heart. He stepped toward her, bewildered and awed. "But I did everything you asked of me," he murmured. Éirenne rose, came to him, and took his hands. Her touch was warm, real. Her eyes, full of love. "My dearest love," she said. "I never promised you a long life, only the gift of understanding, and the chance to change the course of fate." Warmth surrounded him. Forgiveness. Peace. "And now, what will become of us?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Beyond the room, he could hear Eluned's sobs, so faint, so alive, that they made him turn his head. The doorway opened onto a hall that melted into a forest. An endless thicket, growing darker the farther one looked. Éirenne reached out her hand to him. "I've heard Henry has already arrived. Shall we go?" Eamon chuckled softly. "Him too? That old viper." She smiled, and for the first time, no jealousy stirred in his chest. Only love. He took Éirenne's hand, and in that gesture, he understood that words were no longer needed. The fire rose around them, and together they lifted, light as smoke, toward the radiance that awaited them beyond the winter. Chapter 20. The return to Caer Aerath. A single horn blast echoed across the hills, tearing through the silence of dawn. In the distance, men ran from tower to tower along the stone walls. Tiny shadows hurrying along the battlements, lighting torches. Caer Aerath, the fortress of her childhood, rose before them, immense and austere, like an open wound in the green of the English countryside. It had been built only to withstand, not to welcome. And yet, that stone Leviathan, once to Eluned a defilement of the landscape, now greeted her with a solemnity that sent shivers through her. The procession halted at the edge of the moat, out of arrow range but close enough to distinguish the banners fluttering above the walls. On a crimson field, the Lyscaran double-headed hawk spread its wings to the wind. Eluned gently tugged the reins, stopping her mount beside Luthan's. She took in the familiar bulk, the corner towers, the cyclopean walls 6 meters thick, the grey stone that still carried the pulse of Roman craftsmanship. The castle seemed identical to the one she had left behind so many years ago, except for a new walkway, likely added by her father when he widened the moat. And yet, nothing could imprison her within those walls again. The last time she had gazed upon these towers, she had been a wild child, too rebellious for a home so stern. It had been her flight, a starry night in search of the river and freedom, that changed her fate. The stars, she remembered, must have been perfectly aligned that night, for that was how she met Luthan. Now, looking at him in the pale twilight, she saw him as she had then. Hair touched with threads of silver, profile sculpted by the wind. Eyes burning like the sun surrendering behind the hills. "Are you trying to catch fireflies with your mouth?" She had teased him that first time. He had found her half naked, soaked, looking like a stray cat escaped from the stables. And yet he had been enchanted. "By the bones of the saints," he had replied. "No wonder your father lets you wander at night. Perhaps he trusts the forest to make you lose your way home." It had been a cruel barb, though true. No one cared where Eluned went, or if she returned. Until that night, when she stumbled upon a Scotsman with a steady gaze who never left her side. Again. 11 years had passed since that encounter. 12 years of life, of war, and of love, before fate led them back to this place. Eluned sought her husband's hand. "Ready?" Luthan asked. She nodded slightly. All that her father had denied her now belonged to her. Brynden rode beside them, with the seriousness of one who already bore the weight of a name. "Are you certain, mother?" he asked, as if still hoping she might change her mind. He had grown since that night in the forest. His gaze was that of a man who had seen death too soon. From the moment his sword pierced Eamon Lyscaran's heart, innocence had left his eyes. Now his posture was firm, his voice calm, his soul tempered by guilt and conviction. "Yes, my son," Eluned said gently. "I am ready." She removed her father's ring, the seal of Caer, from her finger and placed it in Brynden's palm. Then, almost instinctively, she rested a hand on her slightly rounded belly. She smiled quietly. Not even Luthan knew yet. She could not have told him. He would never have let her come in that state. But time pressed. If they waited any longer, the fortress would fall again under the king's hand. The ring gleamed between her fingers, a small gold band, engraved with 2 feathers crossing a blue lily and the Latin motto, Luceat, Crescat, Vincat. Let it shine. Let it grow. Let it conquer. She remembered her father's lifeless body in the forest, and how his spirit had departed in peace before Luthan arrived. Fate had been cruel, just when Eamon seemed to have changed. When forgiveness had shone in his eyes, the gods had claimed him. But Eluned knew, felt, that he now rested beside Éirenne, and that both awaited her somewhere where the seasons did not pass. Brynden took the ring, and she looked at him with pride. "Wear it on your pinky, my son," she said firmly. "Remember, from this moment forward, everything you do beyond these walls will decide how you are received. You are the new lord of Caer." The boy hesitated for a moment, eyes fixed on the towers. He was more thoughtful than his father, though many would say otherwise. Luthan had been called the Stone Warrior. Now Brynden had to remake that name. "You have David's decree and my father's seal. That will suffice," Eluned said, as if conjuring faith aloud. Meanwhile, the world burned in disputes. Henry of England had died. Of eels, they said. Of poison, they whispered. And his throne was divided between Stephen of Blois and Empress Matilda. If Stephen prevailed, Brynden would receive Aerath by right and convenience. If Matilda ascended, Eluned herself would claim the barony in his name. In either case, King David of Scotland would support their cause, eager to extend his influence over Nordhale. And though many called him the killer of the rightful baron, she and her son knew the truth. Eamon Lyscaran had died for love and redemption, not betrayal. On the walls, the guards had seen the procession. The signal was given from above, and the drawbridge began to rise with a heavy creak. "You are my son," Eluned whispered, pride filling her eyes with tears. The young man rose in the saddle. It was time to enter his destiny. The Scottish army waited behind, steadfast under the northern banners. Brynden looked at the ring one last time, slipped it onto his finger, and dug his heels into the horse's flanks. The animal surged forward, crossing the drawbridge, followed by Eluned and Luthan, galloping behind him with hearts aflame. Cloaked in Eamon Lyscaran's mantle, the family seal shining in his hand, Brynden Cian Farin, Brynden, head of truth, rode like a young king, carrying with him all the fury and glory of the north. At his passage, the gates of Caer swung wide. Eluned passed under the stone arch, then the barbican and the inner bridge, until she reached the old battlements that had once confined her. This time, she was the conqueror. "Welcome home, Lady of Caer," shouted a soldier from the wall. Another echoed, then another, until the air was filled with voices. "Welcome home, welcome home." Eluned straightened in the saddle. She was no longer the nameless girl whom no one cared for. She did not need her father's inheritance to be someone, yet still, seeing those men bow before her made her eyes burn with emotion. Tears slid down her cheeks as the wind tousled her curls. And amid the roar of acclamations, she thought she heard one softer, more intimate, older voice. Eamon's voice, or perhaps just his memory, whispering in her ear, "Welcome home, my daughter." The echo mingled with the wind and the distant bells of the village. And as the winter sun rose over the towers of Caer Aerath, Eluned understood that, at last, the ghosts of the past had found rest. "Welcome home," the wind repeated. "Welcome home." Chapter 21. The Daughter of the Lake. Winter had not yet released its grip on the north when Brynden set out for Edinburgh. The snow was melting in the valleys, yet the forests still breathed an ancient, damp, and chilling air, as if the world had not fully awakened from the solstice's slumber. Beside him rode his father, Luthan Maelvor, his face weathered by the wind, his gaze keen and steady. The journey to King David's court would be long, but necessary. The young man was to be recognized as the rightful lord of Caer Aerath, and the old Lyscaran's seal, now gleaming in his hand, would not suffice without the monarch's blessing. Along the roads, people spoke of wars to the south, the English throne vacant, the barons divided between Stephen of Blois and Empress Matilda. But in Scotland, King David wove his alliances in silence and patience, like a hawk waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The wind blew from the east when, at dusk, father and son halted their horses by a lake hidden among the hills. The water was black and still, veiled in tatters of mist that seemed to drift with the rhythm of a sleeping breath. It was Luthan who saw her first. A figure moved upon the water, pale, wrapped in fog. For an instant he thought it a spectre, a vision of Eluned, or perhaps an echo of the past. But the shape turned toward them, and the light of twilight revealed living skin, wet hair clinging to her face, eyes wide with fear. "Heavens," murmured Luthan, holding his horse back. "A maiden." The wind dragged shreds of mist across the lake. The girl knelt by the water's edge, washing her hands and face in the icy ripples that glimmered under the uncertain dawn. Beside her, on a stone, she had laid her cloak and underdress to scrub them with ash and wild thyme. Her escort slept a few yards away, overcome by weariness, near a dying fire. From the nearby woods came a crack. A man, bearded and filthy, with the look of one fleeing from war, bent over the maiden's clothes, chuckling as he unfastened his belt. She stepped back, her breath a white cloud escaping in spirals. Then, before the shadow could lunge at her, a neigh split the silence. Brynden emerged from the trees, sword drawn, cloak billowing like a fragment of night. The ruffian barely had time to turn. The steel flashed, a cold and certain line, and the threat fell into the snow with a short, almost grateful sigh. The wind roared again, and all was still. The young woman, pale, trembling, yet steady of gaze, tried to cover herself with the damp cloak. Brynden, without a word, bent down to offer his own. It was then she spoke, her voice low and clear, with an accent not his own. "I should not have met you like this, my lord," she said. "But I thank God you passed through this wood." "Luthan," called Brynden, turning to his father. "She's alive." The laird approached, his silhouette framed against the dawn, and regarded the girl with a mixture of gravity and curiosity. There was something about her that stirred memory. Her hair, a copper shade almost luminous, seemed to catch fire in the morning light. And her eyes, so pale they recalled the ice of the fjord, held the same look as that other woman, the one he had found years ago, alone, trembling beside a river. "The stars have a strange humor tonight," murmured Luthan. "It was by such a water that I found your mother." Brynden did not answer. The girl lowered her head, and the fire, in silence, rekindled when they made camp later, sheltered by the pines. That night, the fire crackled beneath a sky filled with auroras. The air smelled of smoke, pine, and foreboding. Luthan slept wrapped in his cloak, while Brynden and the young woman remained awake, facing each other with the fire between them. "I have not yet thanked you for what you did," she said. "My name is Eluned of Garioch. I was traveling to Edinburgh. Or so I thought. King David has summoned me, though I do not know for what purpose." "Alone?" Brynden asked, surprised. "With an escort you have already seen sleeping like a stone." Eluned smiled, and for an instant her face seemed to brighten. "They say the king wants me at his court, perhaps as a lady in waiting. But no one travels to Edinburgh's winter without a darker purpose." Brynden watched how the firelight danced in her hair. "David does not move his pieces by chance," he said. "When my father first brought me before him, he already knew what I had yet to learn. He believed in dreams, in omens, in the dead who guide the living. And you, my lord? Do you also believe in the dead?" "I have spoken with them," Brynden replied, his voice deepening to a near whisper. "My foster grandfather, Taran, came to me from beyond the veil. He showed me the path that led me here." Eluned looked at him for a long time. Not with fear, but with quiet compassion. "Then we are closer than I thought," she said. "My mother also dreamed of the dead. She said kings hear whispers that common men do not." The fire crackled between them. Brynden turned his gaze to the stars. "My foster mother, Lady Eluned, had that gift. She said love and death are the only heralds that never lie." He paused. "Perhaps tonight one of them has brought us together." Eluned lowered her eyes. "If that is so," she whispered, "may the gods be merciful, for I have never feared a fate as much as the one I now sense." A light, faint, bluish, seemed to kindle between them. It was no reflection of sun or water. It was the same light Brynden had seen that night, when Taran's soul faded into the mist. For an instant, the whole lake seemed to shimmer like liquid moonlight. Brynden stared at her. "Then the king sends you. I must present myself before him before the new moon. I am a Garioch." The name drifted between them like an omen. The mist thickened, and for a moment Brynden thought he heard a whisper in the wind, a woman's voice, the same that had spoken in his dreams the prophecy of fire. "Before the flame dies, the hawk shall fly again." The next morning, when Scotland's frozen sun rose over the moors, they resumed their journey toward Edinburgh. The castle loomed in the distance like a colossus carved from stone, and the banner of the Golden Stag fluttered atop its towers. King David received them in his hall, surrounded by light and silence. His eyes, deep, as though they had seen more than one lifetime, fell first upon Brynden, then upon Eluned. "You have arrived," said the monarch, his voice echoing like something ancient. "And as it was foretold, together." Eluned lowered her head, trembling. Brynden frowned. David smiled faintly, unsurprised. "Do not fear. The fate of the houses of Garioch and Aerath was not woven by man, but by the hand that moves the world's threads. The reconciliation the living could not seal shall be sealed by their children." He lifted his gaze toward the stained glass, where sunlight drew blue beams across the floor. "When the snow falls upon both kingdoms, let the fire not die in your hearths." And thus Brynden knew that the meeting by the lake had not been by chance, and that the dead, like old Taran or Baron Eamon, still whispered in the ears of kings. Chapter 22. The Banquet of Edinburgh. The great hall of Edinburgh Castle blazed with the light of 100 torches. The flames trembled in the iron chandeliers, casting golden flashes across goblets, furs, and war banners. Outside, snow fell with solemn slowness, muffling the sounds of the world. King David presided over the high table, dressed in dark garments, a wolf fur cloak upon his shoulders, and the weight of wisdom in his gaze. He seemed to listen to something beyond human voices, as though his mind attended a council known only to the ancient kings of Scotland. At his right sat Brynden of Aerath, young and grave, drinking little and speaking even less. Across from him, Eyelid of Garioch, her copper hair braided neatly, kept her eyes lowered, though from time to time she glanced toward the young laird with a mix of curiosity and caution. The king raised his cup. "Many winters ago," he said, his voice deep and deliberate, "the houses of Caer, Aerath and Garioch shed blood against each other. The dead of those days rest beneath the snow, yet their memory still breathes among us." The silence grew so profound that the crackle of the fire sounded like a sigh. "Tonight," David continued, "I wish for the memory of that blood to become a new bond." His eyes, blue and ancient, settled upon the young pair. "I do not command you to wed. I grant you something rarer than an order: time." A faint murmur passed among the nobles. The king smiled, with the calm of a man who knows himself chosen by a higher design. "You shall travel together to Caer Aerath. There, within the walls that still keep the echo of the dead, you will dwell for 1 month. If, at the end of that time, love or will leads you to unite, I shall bless your bond before God and men. If not, let each follow their path in peace." Eyelid looked at him in surprise. Brynden bowed his head respectfully. "My lord," the young man said, "I will obey your word as I would the voice of my own fate." David nodded slowly. "Fate," he repeated, almost in a whisper. "It is nothing but the memory of the gods." Then the wind swept through the high stained glass, extinguishing a dozen candles. No one moved. For an instant, in that half-light, it seemed that the shadows of the past danced among the guests, unseen, approving the pact with an ancient silence. Chapter 23. The journey to Caer Aerath. They departed at dawn. Luthan Maelvor had already ridden north, leaving behind a quiet blessing and a veiled smile. Now only the two of them remained, Brynden and Eyelid, riding side by side over the hardened snow. The sun, pale and distant, barely pierced the clouds. The air was cold but clear, and crows followed their path from the trees, like heralds of a design the living could not fathom. For a long while they did not speak. The silence between them was dense, almost solemn, broken only by the rhythm of hooves across the moor. It was Eyelid who spoke first. "Tell me the truth, Lord of Caer Aerath. Do you believe the king chose us by chance?" Brynden turned his head to look at her. "No," he answered quietly. "Nothing that happens under this sky is by chance. My grandfather knew it. My mother too. They said the threads of the world are woven in darkness, and men walk upon them without seeing." Eyelid smiled faintly. "Then your fate is woven with mine as well." "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps we were chosen to mend what others broke." She fell silent. In her eyes there was sorrow, but also strength. "My father," she whispered, "died without making peace with yours. He raised me to believe the Caerwyn were enemies of our house, of Maelvor. But," she lifted her gaze to Brynden, her eyes like mirrors of the sky, "you are not what he said." "Nor are you," Brynden replied. "The names we inherit weigh heavier than the deeds we choose. Perhaps it is time we shed them." They rode on until the sun sank behind the mountains. They camped beneath an old oak, where the air smelled of resin and snow. Brynden lit the fire. Eyelid sat across from him, her hands stretched toward the warmth. The crackle of the flames cast long shadows across their faces. In the firelight, she seemed wrapped in a copper glow, almost unreal. "You know," Eyelid said softly, "my mother used to say the fire keeps the memories of those who are gone. If you look closely, you can see them dance among the flames." Brynden fixed his gaze on the fire. For an instant he thought he saw a face. He could not tell if it was Taran, his grandfather, or Eamon Lyscaran, the baron who had died in his arms. A shiver ran down his spine. "Perhaps," he murmured, "the dead have not yet left us." Eyelid nodded, watching him without fear. "If that is so, may they guide us, wherever fate intends to lead." The fire crackled as if in reply. In the distance, the wind carried a faint sound, almost a lament. It might have been the call of an owl, or the echo of a voice following them from beyond the veil. The month King David had granted them had just begun. Chapter 24. The journey to Caer Aerath. The fire crackled softly, breathing like a living being. The forest slept beneath the snow, and the wind did not blow so much as sigh among the bare branches. Brynden and Eluned sat before the embers, wrapped in their trembling glow. The night had closed around them in its secret circle. She wore her cloak over her shoulders, but the cold was fierce, and her breath formed clouds before her face. Brynden watched her in silence. There was a luminous fragility in her profile, as if all the sorrow of the world had taken refuge in that young woman. "You should come closer to the fire," he murmured at last. "The night will show no mercy." Eluned gave a faint smile. "The fire does not fear me," she said. "It is an old friend. But you seem to fear it." "Sometimes the fire reveals more than one wishes to see," he replied, his eyes fixed on the flames, where for an instant he thought he saw a face, fleeting, made of light and smoke, that of his foster mother, or perhaps Éirenne, smiling from beyond time. Eluned watched him for a long while, as if she could guess what he saw. "Are you always so solemn, Lord of Caer Aerath?" she asked softly. "Your eyes seem to carry too many dead." He smiled, sadly. "The dead seek me," he said quietly, "and sometimes they guide me." The fire flared, sending sparks upward like fireflies into the night. Eluned shivered, and he offered her his cloak, but when she reached for it, Brynden gently stopped her by the wrist. "Not like that," he whispered. "Come closer. Warmth is better shared than given." She looked at him with a hesitation that was not fear, but expectation. She moved slowly, sitting beside him, close enough to feel the beat of his heart. The silence thickened between them, and only the fire spoke, murmuring in its ancient tongue. "I did not imagine you like this," she said at last, almost in a sigh. "When I first saw you, I thought you would be like all men who wield a sword, made of iron and will. But you are different." "Different?" he asked. "As if you carried inside something that is not entirely yours," she answered. "A light or a shadow, I could not say which." Brynden looked down at her. The snow falling outside seemed to vanish in the warmth that surrounded them. "If I carry a shadow, perhaps it is yours," he murmured. Eluned meant to answer, but the words caught in her throat. Their eyes met. It was a moment outside of time. The world held still. The fire, as if it knew, leaned toward them. Brynden reached out and brushed her cheek, with a tenderness that startled him. "Keep warm," he said again, but this time his voice trembled. She nodded, leaning closer. Her hair brushed his face, and the touch was enough. The kiss came as something inevitable, like the last snowflake before the thaw. It was a slow, deep kiss, full of restrained emotion that needed no words. There was no haste, no hunger, only recognition. As if they had been searching for each other long before they met. Eluned trembled, and Brynden held her in his arms, feeling the cold, for the first time, give way. When they parted, the air felt different. Lighter, as if an unseen presence had given its blessing. "And now?" she asked with a timid smile. "Now sleep," said Brynden, though his fingers still rested against her cheek. "Tomorrow begins what the king called our month of knowing. And if, at the end of that month, you do not wish to marry me?" Eluned asked, her voice barely audible. Brynden looked at her for a long time, with that otherworldly solemnity in his eyes. "Then the month will not have ended," he said. "For I will keep searching for you through all the winters of the world." She closed her eyes. The fire crackled one last time, and the wind carried the embers toward the forest. Beyond the glow, something moved among the trees, perhaps a deer, perhaps a spectre watching over their fate. But within the circle of fire, there was only stillness, and the murmur of two souls beginning to recognize each other. The Keeper of the Fire. A legend of winter and soul. Beneath the northern star, when the wind wails its song, sleeps the valley of Aerath, veiled by centuries and sorrow. They say a fire dwells there, one that even ice could not quell, the flame of the ancient soul, that never ceases to burn nor to love. Eluned, daughter of the dawn, wove the winter in her tower, her hands, made of snow and sorrow, embroidering her own despair. She dreamed of sleeping seas and faces upon the glass, and heard, in the white mist, a name, Brynden, her bliss and her bane. Brynden, the Keeper of the Fire, wandered through shadow and ruin, his chest guarding a single ember, his guilt, the divine flame. He had killed in war, had lost forgiveness, and sought in the frozen heavens the path toward his redemption. One night, the northern star fell upon the grey mountain, and a blaze of kindled spirit rose above the precipice. Eluned heard its calling, crossed the snow and the sea, following the fire that burned where none dared to go. In the cave of Caer, where time dies into mist, she found him asleep upon the stone, wrapped in his own heat. She spoke to him of life and death, of all that was and will be. And the fire within his silent chest began to tremble and shine again. They loved without promise or name, they loved without word or faith. Two souls the ice had parted, yet the spirit bound anew. And when the northern dawn bathed their final kiss, they say the fire of Aerath rose to the immortal sky. Now, when winter returns and the towers burn once more, a light is seen on the summit, where the Keeper is said to dwell. And on nights of frozen moon, if the soul knows how to listen, two voices whisper the name of the fire that will never die. Epilogue. A Christmas at Caer, in the year of our Lord 1137. Snow fell thick over the towers of Caer, covering the walls with a mantle so white it seemed to erase time itself. On the battlements, torches burned like captive stars, and the air smelled of resin and freshly baked bread. It was their first Christmas since the Union. In the great hall, the heralds had hung branches of holly and red ribbons. The fire roared in the hearth, and the shadows of those who loved danced upon the stone walls. Luthan and Eluned were there, sitting together, their faces lit by the glow of the fire. War, fear, and loss felt like distant memories, erased by laughter and warmth. Eluned was weaving something with golden thread, a small woolen tunic, while Luthan, ever watchful, looked at her as though every movement of her hands were a miracle. Beside them, Eluned watched with tenderness. "Your parents love each other as if the world had never known winter," she murmured. Brynden smiled. "Perhaps because they know winter passes, and what remains is the fire." Eluned leaned back a little, one hand resting over the gentle curve of her belly beneath the linen tunic. The child, or perhaps the girl, moved faintly, and Brynden, with a protective gesture, covered her hand with his. "Too long on your feet, my lady," he said softly. "Your physician will not forgive me if I weary you." "I'm not tired," she replied with a smile. "Only hungry." A mischievous spark crossed her face. "If only your love could be served in a bowl of warm honey." Brynden chuckled quietly and rose to approach the fire. He prepared an infusion of dried flowers and honey, pouring it into a clay cup. When he offered it to her, Eluned brushed his fingers, holding them a moment longer than necessary. "You know," she said, "a year ago I feared I'd have no home, no name, not even a destiny. And now," her gaze softened, "now everything I need is here." "No," he corrected gently. "It's here." He took her hand and pressed it against his chest. "Wherever we are, that will be home." She meant to reply, but her words melted into a sigh. Brynden leaned down and kissed her, slowly, with the tenderness of someone afraid to wake a dream. The kiss tasted of warm honey and forgiveness. At that moment, A draught stirred through the hall. The flames bent to the left, and a faint blue shimmer crossed the air above their heads. Eiluned looked up and smiled, unsurprised. "Luthan," she whispered. "Did you feel it?" The laird nodded, tightening his hold on her hand. "Aye. They're here. All of them." The fire crackled, and within its murmur came a distant laughter, perhaps Éirenne's, perhaps Eamon Lyscaran's, reconciled at last in the memory of their own. Eiluned closed her eyes, resting her forehead on her husband's shoulder. Outside, the chapel bells began to ring. Christmas Eve. Brynden wrapped his cloak around her, as if to shield her from the whole world. "Winter has returned," he murmured. "But it no longer frightens me. Because we've crossed through it together," she answered, with a smile that lit him more brightly than the fire. The wind pressed against the castle walls, and the snow kept falling, silent and pure. On the hearth, the fire did not die. And so, while the voices of the living and the dead blended into a single song, Caer Aerath became once more a place of peace. A flame in the darkness. A heart that kept on burning. Winter Chronicle. According to the annals of Caer Aerath. Anno Domini 1137. The winter was gentler. It is said that on the night of the solstice, a light shone above Caer Aerath, neither star nor human flame, and that the bells rang of their own accord before dawn. In the great hall, beneath garlands of fir, Brynden and Eiluned sealed their vow before their kin, and the air smelled of fresh bread, of wax, and of hope. They say the young woman carried a child within her, and that her husband, with his father's hands and his mother's eyes, watched over her as one guards a sacred flame. Beyond the walls, war still stirred. But that winter was remembered as the time of forgiveness, when the ghosts of the past ceased their wandering, and the spirit of the castle found its peace. The end. Author's note. There are stories that are not born from the fire itself, but from the embers that remain when everything seems extinguished. The flame of Caer Aerath rose from that place, from the tremor between life and memory, from that spark that endures even when winter seems endless. In the 12th century, when Scotland was still a land of shadows and faith, men spoke with ghosts as others pray, and women looked northward for answers that did not always come from God. It was a time when love and death walked hand in hand, and souls wandered through castles and moors, yearning for redemption. I imagined then Brynden, a warrior marked by guilt, and Eiluned, a woman who embodies compassion and mystery. Both are heirs to a flame that does not belong solely to the realm of the living. The flame of forgiveness, of desire that purifies, of the soul that learns to burn without destroying. As in the winter tales of the old bards, their meeting is both a miracle and a warning. No one can extinguish the fire of destiny without paying a price. The spirit of Caer Aerath is also the spirit of our own lives, that invisible threshold where what was still touches what might yet be. Like Dickens, I believe that ghost stories are not about death, but about the possibility of change, even when all seems lost. The specters that visit us do not seek to frighten, but to remind us who we were, what we loved, and what we may still redeem. I have written this story as a kind of pagan prayer, an elegy for souls still seeking light amid the ice. There is no historical precision here, only emotional truth. The certainty that love, in any century, remains a form of resurrection. To those who believe in second chances, to those who have felt a presence by the fire, to those who have loved beyond fear or time, I offer this story. May the flame of Caer Aerath remind you that even on the longest night of the year, if we listen with the heart, a voice, perhaps our own, still burns. With gratitude and wonder. Anya.
Chrismoanum tidis natonte hanen muam filhi hanum vodono tan sola sim